Picture this. You're one of the most powerful military leaders in your country, used to commanding respect wherever you go. Soldiers snap to attention when you pass. Government officials bow slightly in your presence. Your uniform carries weight that opens doors and commands immediate obedience. Now imagine walking up to what you think are just ceremonial guards in funny hats, expecting the same treatment you get back home. You bark an order, expecting instant compliance. Instead, you're about to learn a lesson in protocol, tradition, and respect that will haunt you for the rest of your career. What happens when unstoppable military pride meets an immovable force of centuries-old British tradition? What occurs when a foreign general mistakes the Queen's Guard for ordinary soldiers he can boss around? This is the story of General Ricardo Mendoza, a man whose single moment of arrogance in front of Buckingham Palace became an international incident that nearly destroyed his career, sparked a diplomatic crisis, and taught him the most humbling lesson of his life. Sometimes the smallest mistakes have the biggest consequences. Sometimes a simple misunderstanding can change everything. And sometimes the most powerful people in the world discover that power has its limits in the most embarrassing way possible. This is that story. The black Mercedes sedan pulled up to the gates of Buckingham Palace on a crisp Tuesday morning in October. Inside sat General Ricardo Mendoza, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. At 52 years old, he had climbed the ranks of the Colombian military through sheer determination, tactical brilliance, and an iron will that had never bent to anyone or anything. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection with every medal and decoration positioned exactly where regulations demanded. The 3 stars on his shoulders caught the London sunlight as he stepped out of the vehicle, his aide-de-camp Captain Silver hurrying to keep pace beside him. Mendoza had arrived in London 3 days earlier for a series of high-level defense meetings with British officials, part of an ongoing cooperation agreement between their two nations. The general had built his career on precision and control. In Colombia, when he spoke, colonels listened. When he walked into a room, conversation stopped. His word was law in military circles, and even government ministers treated him with the deference his rank demanded. This trip to London was supposed to be another routine diplomatic mission, another opportunity to demonstrate Colombian military professionalism on the international stage. But General Mendoza carried with him something more dangerous than any weapon, the absolute certainty that his authority was universal. He had spent 30 years believing that military rank transcended borders, that a general was a general anywhere in the world, and that respect was something that could be demanded rather than earned. As they approached the palace gates, Captain Silver reviewed their itinerary one final time. They were scheduled to meet with British defence officials at the Ministry of Defence building in Whitehall later that morning, but the general had insisted on this detour. He wanted to see Buckingham Palace, he said, to pay his respects to British military tradition. It was a gesture that looked good on paper, the kind of thing that would be mentioned in official reports back home. The morning air carried the sounds of London awakening, distant traffic, the clip-clop of horses from the nearby barracks, and the measured footsteps of tourists already beginning to gather for the changing of the guard ceremony that would take place in a few hours. Mendoza breathed it all in, feeling the satisfaction of a man who had earned his place among the world's military elite. "General, perhaps we should proceed directly to our appointment," Captain Silver suggested quietly, checking his watch. He was a careful man, 35 years old, with a reputation for keeping his superior officer on schedule and out of trouble. He had served under Mendoza for 5 years and knew the man's temperament better than most. "Nonsense, Captain," Mendoza replied, his English heavily accented but confident. "We have time. I want to observe how the British conduct their ceremonial duties. There is always something to learn from tradition." They walked along the palace railings, joining the scattered groups of early morning tourists and photographers. The general's trained eye took in everything: the positioning of security cameras, the discreet placement of armed police, the careful balance between accessibility and protection that the British had perfected over decades. Then he saw them. 2 guards stood at their post in front of the palace, motionless as statues. They wore the iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats that had become symbols of British pageantry around the world. Their rifles were positioned precisely, their boots polished to mirror perfection, their faces hidden in the shadow of their enormous hats. To most observers, they were exactly what they appeared to be: ceremonial guards performing an ancient duty, part tourist attraction and part living tradition. They stood with the kind of discipline that comes from years of training, their breathing so controlled it was barely visible, their eyes fixed on some distant point that only they could see. But to General Mendoza, they looked like something else entirely. They looked like soldiers under his command back home. the kind of men who would snap to attention when a general approached. In his mind, military discipline was universal, and these guards, impressive as they might be, were still just soldiers doing their job. The general had heard stories about the Queen's Guard, of course. Everyone had, but stories and legends held little weight for a man who dealt in concrete realities of command and control. He had commanded elite units, special forces, men trained to the highest standards of military excellence. How different could British ceremonial guards really be? Captain Silver noticed the direction of his general's gaze and felt a small flutter of concern. He had researched British military customs before their trip, and he knew that the Queen's Guard operated under protocols that were quite different from anything they were familiar with back home. But he also knew better than to question his superior officer without clear cause. "Impressive discipline," the general murmured, studying the guards with the practiced eye of a military professional. "But I wonder if they maintain proper standards when senior officers are present." The words carried a tone that Captain Silver had heard before, usually right before his general did something that created complications for everyone involved. It was the voice of a man who was about to test boundaries, to see how far his authority could reach. Around them, tourists snapped photographs and chatted quietly among themselves. Children pressed their faces against the palace railings, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty. A tour guide led a group of Japanese visitors past, explaining the history and significance of everything they were seeing. But General Mendoza was no longer listening to any of it. His attention was completely focused on the two guards, and a plan was forming in his mind. It would be interesting, he thought, to see how these British soldiers responded to a foreign general. It would be a test of international military courtesy, a way to gauge the quality of their training. He adjusted his uniform jacket, making sure his rank insignia were clearly visible, and began walking toward the guards. Captain Silver fell into step beside him, his concern growing with each stride. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, and somewhere in the distance, a clock tower began to chime the hour. Neither man could have predicted what was about to unfold. Neither could have imagined that this simple approach to two ceremonial guards would set in motion a chain of events that will be talked about in military circles for years to come. General Mendoza walked forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his authority recognized and respected wherever he went. He was about to discover that some traditions run deeper than rank, and some duties are more sacred than diplomatic courtesy. The Queen's Guard had been performing their role for centuries, through wars and peace, through changes of government and shifts of empire. They had stood their post when foreign dignitaries tried to test them before, and they would stand it long after General Mendoza had returned to Colombia. But in that moment, as the general approached with his aide trailing nervously behind, none of that history mattered. What mattered was that a proud military commander was about to make a mistake that would teach him the hardest lesson of his career, and the guards he was approaching were about to demonstrate exactly why their reputation had endured for so many generations. The distance between them closed with each step, and Captain Silver found himself silently praying that his general would simply observe and move on. But he knew his commanding officer too well to believe that would happen. When General Mendoza saw an opportunity to assert his authority, he rarely let it pass. The moment of truth was approaching, and neither side was prepared to back down. General Mendoza approached the guards with the measured stride of a man accustomed to commanding respect. His boots clicked against the pavement with military precision, each step deliberate and confident. The morning air seemed to hold its breath as he drew closer to the two motionless figures in their red tunics and towering bearskin hats. The guard on the left was Lance Corporal James Morrison, 24 years old, and serving his second tour with the Queen's Guard. He had been standing at his post for 47 minutes, his rifle held at the precise angle required by centuries of tradition. Morrison had grown up in Manchester, the son of a factory worker and a nurse, and joining the army had given him purpose and pride he had never known before. Beside him stood Lance Corporal David Chen, 26 years old, and the grandson of immigrants from Hong Kong. Chen had been with the Queen's Guard for 3 years and took enormous pride in wearing the uniform that represented not just military excellence, but British heritage itself. His grandmother had told him stories of watching the Guards when she first arrived in London, decades earlier, never imagining that her grandson would one day wear the same red tunic. Both men had undergone months of specialized training before being deemed worthy to guard the sovereign's residence. They had learned to stand motionless for hours in all weather conditions, to ignore distractions that would break the concentration of ordinary soldiers, and to follow protocols that had been refined and perfected over generations. They were aware of the approaching general, of course. Their training had taught them to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. They could see his Colombian insignia, the confident way he carried himself, the nervous aide who walked slightly behind him. But their orders were clear and absolute. They were to remain at their post motionless and silent unless directly threatened or given specific commands by authorized British officers. General Mendoza stopped 3 feet in front of the guards, close enough to see his reflection in their polished buttons, close enough to notice that neither man's eyes had moved to acknowledge his presence. For a moment, he simply observed them, taking in the quality of their bearing, the perfection of their uniforms, the absolute stillness with which they maintained their positions. In Colombia, this would have been impossible. No soldier, regardless of their training or orders, would ignore a 3-star general standing directly in front of them. The very idea was unthinkable. Respect for rank was so deeply ingrained in military culture that it transcended specific orders or protocols. Captain Silva positioned himself slightly to the general's left, his unease growing by the second. He had noticed several tourists beginning to gather, drawn by the presence of the foreign officer studying the guards so intently. Cameras were being raised, and he could see the beginning of what might become an unwanted spectacle. "General, perhaps we should continue to our appointment," Silva suggested in Spanish, keeping his voice low and respectful. But Mendoza was not ready to leave. He was genuinely curious about these guards and their training. More than that, he was beginning to feel something he rarely experienced, a challenge to his authority. These men were clearly professional soldiers, yet they were treating him as if he were invisible. It was fascinating and slightly irritating at the same time. "Attention!" the general barked suddenly, his voice cutting through the morning air with the authority of 3 decades of command. The word echoed off the palace walls and seemed to hang in the air for a moment that stretched into eternity. Several tourists stopped their conversations and turned to see what was happening. A photographer raised his camera, instinctively, sensing that something significant was about to occur. Lance Corporal Morrison felt every muscle in his body tense at the command, not from any instinct to obey, but from the effort required to resist it. His training had prepared him for this exact situation. Foreign officers, particularly those from allied nations, sometimes tested the guards' discipline. The correct response was to maintain position and ignore any commands not given by authorized British personnel. Lance Corporal Chen experienced the same momentary tension, the same conscious effort to remain still. He had been warned during training that some foreign dignitaries might attempt to interact with the guards, either from ignorance of protocol or from a deliberate desire to test their discipline. The answer was always the same: maintain position, remain silent, honor the duty. General Mendoza waited for a response that never came. Neither guard moved so much as an inch. Their rifles remained at the same angle, their feet in the same position, their faces hidden in the shadows of their bearskin hats. It was as if his command had been absorbed by the air itself and disappeared without effect. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Captain Silva felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool London morning. He could see more tourists gathering, could sense that his general was entering dangerous territory. But he also knew that intervening now would only make things worse. "I said attention!" Mendoza repeated, louder this time, his voice carrying the edge of authority that had never failed him before. Again, nothing. The guards remained as motionless as the palace itself, as unmoved by his commands as the stone lions that flanked the gates. For the first time in his military career, General Mendoza was experiencing what it felt like to have his authority completely ignored by soldiers under arms. A small crowd was definitely forming now. Tourists who had come to see the famous guards were getting an unexpected show. Several people were recording with their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something unusual. An elderly British gentleman in a tweed jacket shook his head disapprovingly and muttered something about foreign officers who don't understand proper protocol. General Mendoza felt his face beginning to flush. This was not going as he had expected. In his experience, military discipline was universal. A command given by a senior officer was obeyed, regardless of nationality or specific unit protocols. The idea that professional soldiers would completely ignore a general's direct order was so foreign to his understanding that he struggled to process what was happening. But rather than retreat, rather than accept that perhaps he had misunderstood the situation, the general doubled down. His pride, his certainty in his own authority, his 3 decades of never being ignored by men in uniform, all combined to push him forward rather than pull him back. "Soldiers," he called out, switching to English to ensure there could be no misunderstanding. "When a general addresses you, you will respond." The words carried across the courtyard, drawing even more attention. A tour guide leading a group of American visitors paused in her explanation of royal history to watch what was unfolding. Several members of the group began taking pictures, already imagining the stories they would tell when they returned home. Lance Corporal Morrison felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine beneath his heavy wool tunic. Not from the physical effort of standing still, but from the psychological pressure of having a foreign general shouting commands directly at him. His training held firm, but he was human, and the situation was testing every aspect of his discipline. Lance Corporal Chen was experiencing similar strain. The general's voice was impossible to ignore, and every instinct trained into him as a soldier wanted to respond to the authority in that voice. But his specific training as one of the Queen's Guard was stronger. He had sworn an oath not just to obey orders, but to uphold the traditions and protocols of his position. Breaking those protocols, even for a foreign general, would be a betrayal of everything his uniform represented. Captain Silver was now genuinely alarmed. He could see the gathering crowd, could sense the potential for the situation to spiral completely out of control. More importantly, he could see that his general was becoming angry, and an angry General Mendoza was capable of decisions that would have consequences far beyond this moment. "Sir," Silver said quietly in Spanish, moving closer to his commanding officer, "perhaps there are protocols we are not aware of. These guards may have specific orders." "Nonsense!" Mendoza snapped, not taking his eyes off the motionless figures before him. "Military discipline is military discipline. These men are being insubordinate." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Insubordination was one of the gravest offenses in military law, a direct threat to the chain of command that held armies together. For General Mendoza to publicly declare that these guards were being insubordinate was to escalate the situation from a misunderstanding to a formal accusation. The crowd was growing larger, and several people were now openly recording the confrontation. Somewhere in the distance, Captain Silver thought he heard the sound of approaching boots, possibly palace security responding to reports of a disturbance. The morning that had started as a simple diplomatic courtesy call was rapidly becoming something much more serious. General Mendoza straightened his uniform jacket and prepared to make one final definitive command. He had never backed down from a challenge in his life, and he was not about to start now. The fact that these guards continued to ignore him was not just puzzling, it was becoming a personal affront to everything he had worked to achieve in his career. What the general did not understand, what Captain Silver was beginning to suspect, and what the growing crowd of onlookers was about to witness, was that he was not just challenging two individual soldiers, he was challenging an institution that had stood unchanged through centuries of political upheaval, foreign wars, and social revolution. He was testing protocols that had been written in stone long before he was born and reinforced by generations of men who had considered their duty more important than their lives. The Queen's Guard had faced down everything from German bombers to IRA terrorists without breaking their discipline. Two men who had spent years training for exactly this kind of test were not about to let a foreign general, however well-intentioned, break centuries of tradition. But General Mendoza did not know any of this history. All he knew was that his authority was being challenged, and that was something he had never learned to accept. The moment stretched into something that felt almost surreal. General Mendoza stood facing two immobile figures who seemed carved from stone itself, while around them a crowd of tourists and onlookers formed an impromptu theater. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the palace courtyard, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Captain Silver could feel his career flashing before his eyes. He had served faithfully under General Mendoza for 5 years, had helped navigate diplomatic missions across 3 continents, had always managed to keep his commanding officer from crossing lines that could not be uncrossed. But this situation was spiraling beyond his ability to control it. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, a mix of tourists, photographers, and curious locals who had stopped to see what was causing the commotion. Several were recording with their phones, and Silver could imagine the headlines already. Colombian General confronts Queen's Guard. Or, worse. The diplomatic implications were staggering. But General Mendoza was beyond such considerations now. His face had darkened with anger and embarrassment, emotions that he rarely allowed himself to feel, and never in public. The fact that 2 enlisted men were ignoring his direct orders had triggered something primal in his understanding of military hierarchy. It was not just disobedience. It was a fundamental challenge to everything he believed about command and respect. "Final warning!" the general shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "I am ordering you to acknowledge a senior officer." The words carried such authority, such absolute conviction, that several people in the crowd actually took a step back. This was not the voice of a man making a request or testing boundaries. This was the voice of a commander who expected immediate compliance and would not tolerate anything less. Lance Corporal Morrison felt his heart rate increase. The general's voice was impossible to ignore. carrying the kind of authority that had been trained into Morrison since his first day of basic training. Every instinct told him to respond, to snap to attention, to show the respect that military protocol demanded. But his training as one of the Queen's Guard ran deeper than those instincts. Morrison had spent 6 months learning to stand motionless while people shouted at him, tried to distract him, attempted to make him laugh or react or break his concentration. He had been trained to ignore everything except direct orders from his chain of command. Foreign officers, regardless of rank, were not in that chain of command. Lance Corporal Chen was experiencing the same internal struggle, the same test of training versus instinct. But he also understood something that perhaps General Mendoza did not. This was not about personal respect or military courtesy. This was about duty to something larger than any individual officer, something that transcended national boundaries or rank structures. The Queen's Guard represented continuity, tradition, and an unbroken chain of service that stretched back centuries. Every man who had ever worn this uniform had faced similar tests, had been challenged by individuals who did not understand or respect the protocols they were sworn to uphold. Breaking now would not just be a personal failure. It would be a betrayal of every guard who had stood this post before him. A new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Excuse me, sir." Everyone turned to see a British officer approaching, his uniform crisp and his bearing unmistakably professional. This was Major William Hartwell, duty officer for the Queen's Guard, 43 years old, with 25 years of military service behind him. He had been alerted to the situation by palace security and had arrived to assess what was happening. Major Hartwell had dealt with similar situations before. Foreign dignitaries sometimes misunderstood the protocols governing the Queen's Guard, and it was his job to resolve such misunderstandings diplomatically while maintaining the integrity of the traditions his men were sworn to uphold. "General Mendoza, I presume," Hartwell said, approaching with the measured confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "I am Major Hartwell, duty officer for the Queen's Guard. Perhaps I might be of assistance?" For a moment, General Mendoza felt relief flood through him. Finally, someone who understood proper military protocol. Someone who could explain to these guards that they were required to show respect to a visiting general. Surely this British officer would resolve the situation immediately. "Major," Mendoza replied, straightening his uniform and regaining some of his composure. "Your guards here have been ignoring direct orders from a senior officer. This is highly irregular and frankly unacceptable." Major Hartwell nodded politely, but his expression remained carefully neutral. He glanced at the two guards, noting with professional satisfaction that neither had moved so much as an inch throughout the entire confrontation. Their discipline was exactly what it should be, exactly what centuries of tradition demanded. "I understand your concern, General," Hartwell replied diplomatically. "However, I should point out that the Queen's Guard operate under very specific protocols. They are ordered to maintain their post and remain motionless except when receiving commands from their direct chain of command." The words were spoken politely, even deferentially, but their meaning was clear. General Mendoza was not in the chain of command for these guards, and therefore his orders carried no weight whatsoever. General Mendoza felt his anger flare again. This was becoming worse, not better. Now he was being told by a major, an officer of junior rank, that his commands were invalid. The situation had moved from puzzling to insulting to downright intolerable. "Major, I think you misunderstand," Mendoza said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I am a 3-star general. These men are enlisted soldiers. Military protocol is quite clear about the respect due to senior officers, regardless of nationality." Captain Silver stepped closer to his general, desperate to find a way to defuse the situation before it exploded completely. He could see more British personnel arriving, could sense that this confrontation was about to become an international incident of significant proportions. Major Hartwell remained calm, but his jaw tightened slightly. He had served his country for a quarter-century, had been deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq, had commanded men in combat situations where protocol often meant the difference between life and death. He was not going to be lectured about military courtesy by a foreign officer who clearly did not understand the situation he had created. "General," Hartwell said, his voice still polite but carrying a new firmness, "I appreciate your perspective, and I certainly respect your rank and experience. However, the Queen's Guard have been performing their duties according to the same protocols for over 300 years. These protocols do not recognize the authority of foreign officers, regardless of rank." The words hit General Mendoza like a physical blow. He had never, in 3 decades of military service, been told that his rank was meaningless. The concept was so foreign to his understanding of military hierarchy that he struggled to process it. Around them, The crowd had grown to nearly 100 people. Cameras were clicking constantly, phones were recording every word, and several news reporters had arrived after being alerted to the unusual confrontation taking place at Buckingham Palace. "This is ridiculous," General Mendoza declared, his voice rising again. "Are you telling me that British soldiers can simply ignore orders from Allied officers? What kind of discipline is that?" "The kind of discipline," Major Hartwell replied firmly, "that has protected the Crown for 3 centuries. These men are not just soldiers, General. They are guardians of a tradition that predates both our careers and will continue long after we are gone." The philosophical difference between the two officers was becoming clear to everyone watching. General Mendoza saw military rank as universal, transcending national boundaries and specific assignments. Major Hartwell understood that some duties were more specific, more sacred, than general military protocol. Captain Silver could see that his general was approaching a point of no return. When General Mendoza became this angry, this convinced that his authority was being challenged, he became capable of actions that would have far-reaching consequences. Silver had seen it before in Colombia, had watched his commanding officer make decisions that created problems for months afterward. "Sir," Silver whispered urgently in Spanish, "perhaps we should contact the embassy. This situation requires diplomatic—" "No!" Mendoza snapped, cutting him off. "This is a military matter. These soldiers will acknowledge proper authority, or there will be consequences." The threat hung in the air like storm clouds. Major Hartwell felt his own anger beginning to rise, though he kept it carefully controlled. He had been patient, had explained the situation diplomatically, had shown the respect due to a visiting general. But if General Mendoza was threatening his men, the conversation was about to change dramatically. Lance Corporal Morrison and Lance Corporal Chen remained motionless through all of this, but both were acutely aware that the situation was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. They could feel the tension radiating from the officers behind them, could sense that their duty to remain at post was about to be tested in ways their training had prepared them for, but hoped they would never experience. The crowd was now large enough to create a traffic problem, with police beginning to establish a perimeter to control the gathering of onlookers. News crews were setting up equipment, and several diplomatic vehicles were arriving as word of the confrontation spread through official channels. What had started as a simple tourist visit to Buckingham Palace was rapidly becoming an international incident that would be reported around the world. 2 immovable objects, Colombian military pride and British military tradition, were about to collide with forces that neither side had fully anticipated. And at the center of it all stood 2 young men in red tunics and tall black hats, maintaining their discipline and their duty while the diplomatic world began to crumble around them. The confrontation had reached a critical point, where diplomacy and military pride balanced on a knife's edge. The crowd of onlookers had swelled to over 200 people, creating a human amphitheater around the unfolding drama. News crews from 3 different networks had arrived, their cameras capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming an international incident. General Mendoza stood rigid with anger and disbelief. In his mind, this had moved beyond a simple matter of protocol. This was now about fundamental respect for military authority, about the basic principles that held armies together across the world. The fact that 2 enlisted men continued to ignore him while their officer defended their insubordination was an affront to everything he had spent his career building. Major Hartwell, for his part, was growing increasingly concerned. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but never one that carried such potential for diplomatic catastrophe. He could see Colombian embassy vehicles arriving, British security officials coordinating through earpieces, and government ministers being awakened from their morning routines to deal with an unprecedented crisis. But the 2 guards at the center of it all remained as motionless as monuments. Lance Corporal Morrison and Lance Corporal Chen had now been standing in perfect position for over an hour. Through shouting and arguments and the flash of 100 cameras, their discipline was being tested in ways that went beyond their training, yet they held their posts with unwavering dedication. The situation took another turn when a new figure arrived on the scene. Ambassador Patricia Whitfield, the British ambassador to Colombia, had been contacted by her staff and had rushed to the palace to assess the situation. She was a career diplomat with 30 years of experience in delicate international negotiations, but even she had never seen anything quite like what was unfolding in front of Buckingham Palace. "General Mendoza," she said, approaching with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to diffusing international tensions. "I'm Ambassador Whitfield. Perhaps we might discuss this situation in a more private setting?" But the general was beyond diplomatic solutions now. His pride had been wounded too deeply. His authority challenged too publicly. The presence of cameras and crowds only made it worse. creating an audience for what he perceived as his humiliation at the hands of two enlisted men and a junior officer. "Ambassador," he replied stiffly, "this is not a diplomatic matter. This is about military discipline and the basic respect owed to senior officers. Your guards are in direct violation of military protocol." Ambassador Whitfield glanced at Major Hartwell, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. The situation was delicate, but it was also clear-cut. The Queen's Guard had acted correctly according to their orders and traditions. The problem was explaining this to a foreign general who seemed unwilling or unable to accept that his authority had limits. At that moment, another voice cut through the tension. It came from an elderly man who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what was happening. "Excuse me," the man said, approaching with the slow but confident steps of advanced age. "Might I have a word?" All eyes turned to this new arrival. He was perhaps 70, 5 years old, well dressed in a traditional British style, and carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a man accustomed to command. His voice carried an authority that was different from military rank but no less compelling. "I am Lord Pemberton," he said, addressing General Mendoza directly, "former colonel of the Grenadier Guards, and I have had the honor of serving with the Queen's Guard in various capacities for over 50 years.
The introduction carried weight that even General Mendoza could recognize.
Here was someone who understood both military protocol and the specific traditions governing the Guards, someone who might finally be able to explain what was happening in terms that made sense. "Lord Pemberton," the general replied, his anger cooling slightly in the presence of obvious authority and experience. "Perhaps you can explain to me why professional soldiers are ignoring direct orders from a senior officer." Lord Pemberton nodded thoughtfully, as if considering how best to explain something that was simultaneously simple and incredibly complex. He had seen this kind of misunderstanding before, though rarely played out on such a public stage with such serious diplomatic implications. "General," he began, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher addressing a particularly difficult subject, "what you are witnessing is not insubordination. It is the highest form of military discipline. These young men are demonstrating a level of duty that transcends personal comfort or convenience." General Mendoza frowned, not understanding the distinction Lord Pemberton was making. Duty was duty, orders were orders. The concept seemed straightforward to him. "You see," Lord Pemberton continued, "the Queen's Guard do not serve primarily as soldiers in the traditional sense. They serve as guardians of something far more important than any individual, regardless of rank or nationality. They guard the continuity of our constitutional monarchy, the stability of our system of government, the very essence of what makes Britain, Britain." The old man paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "When these men put on this uniform, they swear an oath that supersedes all other military obligations. They promise to maintain their post regardless of what happens around them. They have stood their ground during bombing raids, terrorist attacks, and yes, confrontations with foreign officers who did not understand their role." Captain Silver found himself listening intently, finally beginning to understand what had gone so wrong with their simple visit to the palace. This was not about military protocol or international courtesy. This was about something much deeper, something his general had completely failed to comprehend. During World War II, Lord Pemberton went on, guards remained at their posts while bombs fell around them. During the troubles with the IRA, they maintained their discipline while under direct threat of assassination. These traditions are not ceremonial, General. They are sacred. General Mendoza felt something shifting in his understanding, though his pride still resisted accepting what he was hearing. "But surely," he said, "basic military courtesy—"
Basic military courtesy, Lord Pemberton interrupted gently but firmly, requires understanding and respecting the duties and traditions of other armed forces.
What you have been asking these men to do is abandon their sacred oath for the sake of your personal convenience." The word stung because they carried the ring of truth. General Mendoza was beginning to realize that his actions over the past hour had not demonstrated military leadership or appropriate command presence. They had demonstrated ignorance of local customs and disrespect for traditions he had not bothered to understand. Ambassador Whitfield seized the moment to step forward. "General," she said diplomatically, "Lord Pemberton speaks with the authority of someone who has dedicated his life to these institutions.
Perhaps we might consider this a learning experience rather than a failure of protocol."
Major Hartwell remained silent, but he could see that the tone of the confrontation was shifting. The arrival of Lord Pemberton had provided exactly the kind of authoritative voice that could explain the situation without either side losing face completely.
"These guards," Lord Pemberton continued, gesturing toward the still motionless figures of Morrison and Chen, represent something that very few military units in the world can claim. They are living links to centuries of continuous service, unbroken traditions that connect today's British Army to its deepest roots.
He paused again, studying General Mendoza's face to gauge whether his words were having any effect.
In Colombia, General, you have your own proud military traditions. You understand what it means to serve something larger than yourself.
These young men are doing exactly that. They are serving their queen, their country, and their heritage in the most profound way possible. General Mendoza stood silently for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. Around him, the crowd waited to see how he would respond. Cameras continued to record, diplomats held their breath, and two young men in red tunics maintained their perfect discipline while history unfolded around them. For the first time since this entire confrontation began, General Mendoza was beginning to understand that he might have been wrong, not just tactically wrong, not just diplomatically wrong, but fundamentally wrong, about what he was witnessing and what he had been demanding. The realization was not an easy one for a man accustomed to being right about military matters, but it was beginning to dawn on him that his authority, vast as it might be in Colombia, had very specific limits in this place, with these men, under these circumstances. The moment of truth was approaching, and everyone present sensed that whatever happened next would determine whether this incident became a diplomatic disaster or a learning experience that both sides could walk away from with their dignity intact. The silence stretched across the palace courtyard like a held breath. General Mendoza stood surrounded by diplomats, officers, cameras, and curious onlookers, but in that moment he felt utterly alone with his thoughts. Lord Pemberton's words had hit their mark, penetrating the armor of pride and certainty that had carried him through 3 decades of military service. For the first time in his career, General Mendoza was confronting the possibility that he had been completely wrong about something fundamental. Not just tactically mistaken or diplomatically clumsy, but wrong at the deepest level about what he was witnessing and what he had been demanding. He looked again at the two guards, seeing them now with different eyes. Instead of insubordinate soldiers ignoring his authority, he began to see young men performing one of the most difficult duties in military service, standing perfectly still while the world erupted in chaos around them. Their discipline was not defiance of his command, but dedication to something older and deeper than rank or nationality. Captain Silva watched his general with growing hope and anxiety. He could see the internal struggle playing out across Mendoza's face, could sense that his commanding officer was wrestling with concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy. The next few minutes would determine whether this incident destroyed both their careers or became a lesson in humility that might actually strengthen them. Lance Corporal Morrison and Lance Corporal Chen remained motionless through all of this, but both were acutely aware that their ordeal was approaching some kind of resolution. They had now been standing in perfect position for nearly 2 hours through confrontation and argument and international crisis. Their legs ached, their uniforms were damp with perspiration, but their commitment to duty never wavered. Ambassador Whitfield recognized the crucial moment and chose her words carefully. "General," she said softly, "we all make mistakes when we encounter traditions and customs that are unfamiliar to us. What matters is how we respond when we realize our error." The word error stung, but General Mendoza was beyond denying reality. The evidence was overwhelming, the explanation clear, and his own behavior suddenly appeared to him as it must have appeared to everyone else. The actions of a foreign officer who had assumed his authority was universal and had been proven wrong in the most public way possible. Lord Pemberton stepped closer, his elderly face kind but serious. "General," he said, "these young men have just given you a demonstration of military excellence that few officers ever witness. They have shown you what it means to serve with absolute dedication, regardless of personal cost or comfort. In my view, you should consider yourself privileged to have seen such discipline." The words reframed everything. Instead of witnessing insubordination, General Mendoza had been given a masterclass in military dedication. Instead of being insulted by inferior soldiers, he had encountered elite troops performing their duties at the highest possible level. Major Hartwell sensed that the moment was right for a gesture of reconciliation. "General," he said, "if you would like, I would be honored to explain more about the history and traditions of the Queen's Guard. Perhaps we might arrange a more formal briefing about British military customs during your visit." The offer was diplomatic genius, providing General Mendoza with a way to save face while acknowledging that he had something to learn. It transformed his ignorance from a failure into an opportunity for cultural exchange and mutual understanding. General Mendoza stood quietly for another long moment, aware that hundreds of people were watching him, that cameras were recording his every expression, that his response would be analyzed by military historians and diplomatic experts for years to come. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. Then, slowly and deliberately, he stepped back from the guards and came to attention himself. His movement was so unexpected that the crowd fell completely silent, waiting to see what would happen next. General Mendoza raised his right hand in a crisp military salute directed toward Lance Corporal Morrison and Lance Corporal Chen. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the courtyard with absolute clarity. "I apologize," he said formally, addressing both the guards and everyone present. "I have acted with ignorance of your customs and disrespect for your traditions. These soldiers have demonstrated discipline that honors their uniform and their service. I was wrong to question their dedication." The words landed like thunderclaps in the silence. A three-star general publicly apologizing, saluting enlisted men, admitting error in front of an international audience. It was unprecedented, brave, and completely unexpected. Lance Corporal Morrison felt his heart swell with pride, though his expression never changed. To have a foreign general recognize and honor their duty was an extraordinary validation of everything they had been trained to do. Lance Corporal Chen experienced similar emotions, feeling that their silent ordeal had been vindicated in the most powerful way possible. They had maintained their discipline, upheld their traditions, and earned recognition from someone who had tested them to the absolute limit. Lord Pemberton smiled slightly, recognizing true leadership when he saw it. "General," he said approvingly, "that was the response of a genuine officer. You have shown that real military leaders can admit their mistakes and learn from them." Ambassador Whitfield felt a wave of relief wash over her. The diplomatic crisis was ending not in disaster, but in mutual respect and understanding. This story would be told very differently now, as an example of how cultural misunderstandings could be resolved through dialogue and good faith. Major Hartwell stepped forward and returned General Mendoza's salute with military precision. "General," he said formally, "your acknowledgement of our traditions honors both your uniform and ours. You are welcome at this post anytime." Captain Silver felt tears threatening his eyes as he watched his commanding officer transform potential humiliation into leadership excellence. This was why he had chosen to serve under General Mendoza, the man's ability to grow, to learn, to become better than he had been before. The crowd began to disperse slowly, sensing that the drama had reached its conclusion. Some tourists looked disappointed that there would be no further confrontation, while others seemed moved by what they had witnessed. The news crews began packing their equipment, already working on how to frame this story for their audiences. General Mendoza lowered his salute but remained standing at attention for another moment, paying his respects to traditions he was only beginning to understand. When he finally relaxed his posture, he looked like a different man than the one who had approached the guards 2 hours earlier. "Major Hartwell," he said, "I would very much appreciate that briefing you offered. I clearly have much to learn about British military customs." "It would be my pleasure, General," Hartwell replied. "Perhaps we could arrange it for this afternoon, after your scheduled meetings at the Ministry of Defense." As the immediate crisis faded, practical matters began to reassert themselves. General Mendoza still had official appointments to keep, diplomatic protocols to observe, and a reputation to rebuild after this very public learning experience. Lord Pemberton approached the General one final time before departing. "General," he said quietly, "what happened here today will be remembered, but not in the way you might fear. Military history is full of officers who refused to admit their mistakes and paid terrible prices for their pride. You chose a different path, and that choice honors you." Ambassador Whitfield coordinated with Captain Silver to ensure that appropriate follow-up meetings would take place, that proper cultural briefings would be provided, and that this incident would become a bridge to better understanding rather than a barrier to future cooperation. As the crowd finally dispersed and normal palace routines resumed, Lance Corporal Morrison and Lance Corporal Chen remained at their post, as they would for another hour until their relief arrived. They had completed one of the most challenging duties any Queen's Guard had ever faced, and they had done so with perfect honor. General Mendoza walked away from Buckingham Palace, a humbler but wiser man. He had learned that authority has boundaries, that respect must be earned rather than demanded, and that true military excellence sometimes looks very different from what he had expected. The story of the foreign general who tried to order the Queen's Guard spread quickly through diplomatic and military circles, but it was told not as a tale of embarrassment, but as an example of how genuine leaders respond when they discover they have been wrong. General Mendoza's public apology and salute became legendary, cited in leadership courses and diplomatic training programs as the correct way to handle cultural misunderstandings. Years later, General Mendoza would return to London many times, always making a point to visit the Queen's Guard and pay his respects to the institution that had taught him one of the most important lessons of his career. He never again assumed that his authority was universal, never again demanded respect without first offering it, and never again forgot that the most powerful response to being wrong is the courage to admit it publicly and learn from the experience. The Guards, for their part, continued their ancient duty with the same dedication they had always shown. Their perfect discipline during the confrontation became part of the regiment's unofficial history, passed down to new recruits as an example of what it truly means to serve with honor. And in the end, what could have been a diplomatic disaster became instead a powerful demonstration of how military professionals from different cultures could find common ground in mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to admit when they had something new to learn.